Today's class is on inclusive education and why the Gen Ed curriculum is so important for students with disabilities to have access to. We're going to start off with just kind of something funny to think about. This is from the parent side, and as you can see, it shows a bunch of aliens in a convention, and one of the aliens from Mars says, "Let me get this straight. You label certain kids and take them away from the rest of the kids and call that special? Then you group those kids in separate placements by their labels and call that individualized? What planet are you from?" I think this is quintessentially the most important part of this lecture today is what are we doing with students with disabilities and why do we justify that as being individualized education? So today what we're going to cover is we're going to define inclusive education, going to give a rationale, and then finally talk about both strategies for the classroom as well as student-specific strategies. Now, the whole course is really based on that last point, so just know today is just a brief overview of those pieces. An opening thought is the idea that inclusion doesn't just happen because we call it inclusion. And in fact, as the quote says, inclusion without resources, without support, without teacher preparation time, without commitment, without a vision statement, without restructuring, without staff development, won't work. And there's a reference if you want to check out the entire reference there. But that's the idea, is this doesn't just happen because we want it to or because we believe in it. We have to do something about it. So the next slide, we're going to define what inclusive education is. And this is important for the course as we're talking because you may or may not see it in your placements. You may or may not see it as you're visiting classrooms. And so I just want you to understand when we talk about inclusive education, this is what we're talking about. First of all, we're talking that students go to their neighborhood schools or have the choice to attend the school that they want. So this is not the school they belong to because they have a certain disability. This is the neighborhood school that all their neighbors go to, that their siblings attend, that's there in their neighborhood. The next piece is that it's an age-appropriate placement in grade level or content area classes. So this idea of putting in all 5th to 7th graders or a group of kids based on their ability levels, that's not necessarily inclusive education. And then finally, a number of students with disabilities in the class matches natural proportions. So having 10 kids who have autism in a class of 12 kids, that's not the natural population of what we see out in the general community. So that would not be inclusive education either. Now, we also want to identify that students are provided with instructional supports that are necessary for educational success. So, for example, general and special educators both own the student's program. There's no such thing as your kid, my kid. Every kid is every teacher's responsibility. Now, the program is also linked to the core, or there's an alternative based on the IEP. So when we start getting into students with more cognitive and multiple disabilities, their curriculum might be based more functionally and off the IEP, but students with just moderate and even severe cognitive disabilities can certainly have access to the core, and the minute we change that, we're going to end up changing the outcomes for that individual as it applies to independent living, employment, abilities to make their own decisions. The other thing that we're looking at is natural supports. We shouldn't always rely on care providers and Voc Rehab and DSPD and all of these special services to do the things that the rest of us call our brothers and sisters or relatives or friends for. So let's look at what natural supports are, and that's part of inclusive education. And then the idea of adapted instruction. Teachers cannot just teach the way that they've always taught and plan to access information for kids. We might need to, and certainly for kids with disabilities, we're going to have to adapt our instruction to meet their needs. Now, the other idea is social success. It's not all about academics. We want to make sure that kids are able to connect to their peers. We don't want to set them up for failure. So we create a classroom and a school culture that accepts diversity, and diversity is a really important piece of all of this because people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the United States, and So thinking about disability as a diverse group is a much more progressive way than looking at somebody through this lens of, can we fix these issues? Another idea is promoting regular and frequent interactions between students with and without disabilities. We put people together who have similar characteristics all the time, and then we're surprised when they don't naturally gain skills that they didn't already have. That makes no sense when human beings, in essence, are social creatures and we learn through social constructs. To deny individuals that social construct to learn, that is not inclusive education. And then finally, looking at using strategies that support the development of friendships. This is important because we often are very comfortable intervening in academic needs, but not always very comfortable in the social skills. And when we look down the road at effective post-school outcomes, it is individuals who have learned to develop friendships and social networks that succeed in jobs and relationships and out in the community. And those that struggle with social skills will get fired more often, for example, than an individual who doesn't necessarily possess the work skills but has better social skills. So we've got to get better at doing that to promote full inclusion. So what do these schools look like? Well, the first thing is that we have common standards and expectations for all students. There's no such thing as saying we want all 6th grade students sitting here in the cafeteria, and all the SPED students over here. That's not common standards. The standard is the same for all students. Another thing is that a school has to commit to individualized instruction. We're seeing that more and more with RTI teams, PLC teams. We're seeing that when folks get together and really problem solve and collaborate to come up with ideas that ensure students get instruction in these general classrooms. Another idea is teaming. Schools really do have to commit resources to allow teachers to team together. They need time to think and talk and do paperwork, create. So there has to be a commitment at the school-wide level to allow for teaming. And finally, block scheduling does that very well in that teachers can get release blocks to work with other teachers to go in and support students in the classrooms that they belong in with their peers. So block scheduling is a really important piece of all of this. So as we're going through, I want you to just take down a piece of paper, pencil, or you can type it in your laptop if you have that with you. But we're going to do a quick fact or fiction, and I'll give you the answers here at the end. But the first question is, do you believe this is fact or fiction that educational outcomes for students with severe disabilities are superior in self-contained programs? Again, just write down, do you believe that's fact or fiction? And you might want to think about why. So the next one is, the academic engaged time of students with severe disabilities is superior in inclusive programs. So that is that they spend more time on content if they're in inclusive programs. The next question is, inclusive programs negatively impact educational outcomes for students without disabilities. Now, what do you think about that? We certainly have a lot of teachers that believe that students with disabilities kind of take everybody else off track, or they steer the class in the wrong direction sometimes. So think about that. Another one, self-contained programs are more cost-effective than inclusive programs. Write down your answer. And moving forward, homogeneous student groupings produce better achievement than heterogeneous groupings. That is to say that students with like characteristics make students progress better, faster, farther than those that are mixed ability groups, for example. Now, the next question, students with severe disabilities are socially accepted and develop lasting friendships with peers without disabilities. What do you think? Do you see people with disabilities having friends who don't have disabilities? And the next question, grade level and subject area teachers do not want students with severe disabilities in their classes. So before we answer those questions, here's some rationale that I want you to think about. The research is really clear on inclusive education practices for students with severe or low incidence disabilities, as it's known more nationally. Severe disabilities, by the way, is the terminology that's used in the Utah teaching license. So I keep it here, but just know it's becoming fairly antiquated in its terminology. So what research suggests is that for students with disabilities, they have better adjustment after school if they're educated along their non-disabled peers, that they have better behavior, and that it's at least as good as those in cluster programs, which, you have to think about. These students in cluster programs are working on behavior all day long. How does the research say that students who don't work on that all day, every day, is at least equally achieving? And then finally, the rate of IEP goal completions is comparable to students in cluster programs. So if you think about those two final ones, you have to question the justification of cluster programs. Now, some other kinds of things to think about is that the engagement of students in class is comparable to those that are in special ed classes. So it's not just students twiddling their thumbs in the back of a gen ed classroom. They are, when you take data and actually watch, they're engaged at least as much. In addition, rates of academic engagement is comparable to students served without disabilities. So they're not more off task than their peers. We just tend to pay attention more. So the research has been really helpful in saying, let's take a look at this without bias and look at the peer comparison groups in and out of special ed classrooms and with non-disabled peers. And finally, one of the really good points is that when students are included in gen ed classrooms, they develop friends that do not have disabilities, which we find lasting impacts for. Again, if you think of this as a social justice movement, we don't want to relegate any one group of in our population to having only access to the same group that we socially construct. And so the same thing is that they will have friends who do not have disabilities. Now, the research has also looked at the question of what about those without disability? So the first thing is those who do not have disabilities but are educated with those who do, they tend to have an increased acceptance of people with disabilities. Now, this is really important because they become bosses, friends, partners, community members down the road. So if you look at maybe generations before us, if they believe in the special people in special places model, the odds are really good that that's exactly how they were served. Now, another thought is that those who do not have disabilities actually have better self-esteem and self-concept when they are educated with people without disabilities. And it comes from having a global perspective, understanding where their place is in the world, looking at challenges that they may not have. Particularly teenagers have a difficult time kind of getting outside of their own experiences and understanding that life can be difficult for lots of different people and in different ways. And by limiting our access to others, we tend to have a very narrow focus. Now, the important thing, again, we've talked about friendships, but the important thing about academic achievement is this invalidates the argument that people lose out on their academic achievements when they're educated with students with disabilities. That does not end up being true. And also, it doesn't pan out that it takes them off track either. They're just as engaged when they have students with disabilities in their class as when they don't. So, circling back to IDEA from other classes, there's this idea of least restrictive environment. The idea that students need to be able to participate in gen ed curriculum, and that the IEP actually documents how. So, for example, in your short-term annual goals, there has to be the idea that we're meeting the child's needs and how they're going to be involved in that gen ed curriculum. Now this is just a graphic to show, if you look at the very bottom where we might have an individual in a classroom, there should be some personal support strategies. So this includes things that are just specific to individual students who may need maybe dietary considerations or behavioral strategies or time management ideas. And we can go in two different ways. One is on the right, the student-specific instructional strategies. So what particularly does that student need? And on the left, what are some things that the classroom can do? What are those strategies that the classroom teacher can implement? And then they both come up to that opportunities to respond, because the idea is we can teach things till we're blue in the face, but if we never give somebody an opportunity to practice, it's invalid. Many of us have had that experience with language, for example. We've taken Spanish 1, 2, 3, 4, but if we've never had to practice it, if we've never had to use it functionally, it doesn't really pan out to be very useful to us other than in short stints. But if we give students opportunities to respond, they will achieve. And if you think of this in the inclusive models, then it helps you frame why students are involved and what our role needs to be. If you can even take this graphic too, on the left hand, that might be general ed supports, and on the right hand side, that could be special ed supports, but you see it circles back that they're working together. So let's talk about these things for the classroom foundations. These are the strategies that have been validated by research. The first is we have to teach effective behaviors. We want heterogeneous classrooms, meaning mixed group, active learning, and peer tutoring. Okay, so let's take each one of those and break them down. Effective teaching behaviors include students experience high rates of success. So we all get frustrated in environments, but if frustration is our experience all the time, most of us don't want to continue learning like that or working in that environment. So we have to make sure students are successful. Now, the other idea is systematically presenting new concepts. Now, in this course, we are going to be breaking this down. This is one of the key elements of this course, is how do you teach? How do you break down those concepts? And then how do you review older concepts so we don't lose them, and how do you link it to new material? So this is a very important concept for especially special ed teachers to learn, but if general ed teachers can pick this up too, even better. We have to be able to give immediate feedback to students, so waiting till tomorrow to hear how they did today is a really bad idea. It has to be immediate and valuable. And then finally, frequent assessment. Not only are students not getting the feedback they need if we're not assessing them regularly, but we're not paying attention to their growth and development, or on the flip side, their lack of growth and development, so that we change our ideas. Now, this idea of heterogeneous classrooms is that in general, teachers should be grouping heterogeneously for most subject areas. Now, that might go against some other things that you've learned, but if you think about it, it makes sense. If you put your toughest of the tough kids together, it makes that group tougher than any other model. And I think in special ed, particularly in severe, we see that a lot. The tough kids get put together, the kids with behavioral problems get put together, the kids that are drastically behind get put together, and we expect them to learn from that. And they don't. In fact, what they learn is that that is the average, that they're not behind, or that their behavior is average. So it doesn't set them up for very good modeling. Now, we can use within ability grouping. That is more of the people grouped based on their ability needs, but we only promote acquisition of specific skills. And if you think about it, this makes sense. There might be a student who sat through it and sat through a learning module yesterday, and they need more repetition with it. You might have an English language learner that's struggling to pick up the academic language behind something, so it's a little lost. And you might have a kid who typically functions with their peers, but at the same time missed the lecture yesterday. That would make sense to do within ability grouping while they acquire the skill. But you should never ever have a group of students that are always the same and always learn together. It's not a good idea for behavior problems specifically, and it's not a good idea for modeling. And then finally, this idea that we're restructuring the groups based on subject area and instructional tasks. So there should never be this group, the purple dinosaurs, or the letters A, or the high group or the low group, or anything like that. And instead, we should always be restructuring our groups so the kids are getting the needs their needs met at the level that they require. Now, the third one is active learning. We want to see high rates of academic engagement. If kids are off task more than they're on, there's something wrong with the way it's being taught, with the way we're demonstrating it. It could be through our process, our product, our environment, all those great things you learned in the intro class to differentiate. We need to adjust that if our students are not engaged. The other thing is we need a toolbox of strategies, and just have one trick ponies is not going to help our students. We've got to have a whole bunch of different strategies that work for different kids and different topics and different days of the month, all of that good stuff. We have to think through a bunch of different strategies, which again, you'll learn a great handful in this class as well as our other special ed classes. Students are encouraged to work in groups, and this is really important for multiple reasons. Most of what we do in society is group work, and that's not just in school, but also in the workforce, in our families. And to have students work one-on-one by themselves all the time, it's not going to help them engage with others. Now, curriculum and instruction is designed to promote cooperation versus competition. This is one of the things in the United States we are starting to do wrong, is just getting students to compete against each other rather than themselves, and rather than teaming together for a common goal. We're seeing massive impacts in all sorts of ways in our communities when we only compete for things. Now, peer tutoring is amazing. Let me just say that some of the best programs you're going to be seeing are those that include elements of peer tutoring. Now, this, for one, can give you some alternative teaching arrangements in which students act for instructional agents for each other. That's not always to say students with disabilities are getting that service. Sometimes they can explain it to their peers. Now, there's class-wide peer tutoring, and there's cross-age peer tutoring. Class-wide, of course, are students that are in groups and they're helping each other. Everybody gets a role. Everybody has opportunities to be the leader. And cross-age means your fifth graders are working with your third graders. One cautionary tale is, again, when you're thinking of social justice kinds of movements, you don't want to only have your students with disabilities tutoring little kids all the time. What that shows is that we don't think that they're capable of being helpful to people their own age, and we don't want to set that expectation. But cross-age peer tutoring is effective depending on the ways it's done. We'll talk more about peer tutoring later in the semester. So those are the class-wide things you can do. Now there's student-specific strategies. First one's embedded instruction. We're going to be talking a lot about this. You should have done some readings this week for this. And then also personal supports. With embedded instruction, the options we have are to distribute the trials within ongoing activities. So for example, we might be teaching students some science words during downtime in the larger classroom, just to get them up to level with their peers, or give them access to a little more vocabulary. Another idea is that the environment has to be engineered to create opportunities for students to perform. So once again, if we're not creating an environment where students have to ask for something, for example, why would they ever pick up language? Okay. Now, a systematic response, prompting and fading with feedback procedures. This is, again, something that you'll have more instruction on, but the idea is you don't just expect students to do something 100% by themselves, nor do you completely do everything for them, but it's this idea of paying attention to where they are and providing the appropriate supports they need. And then, of course, we have assessment there, where students get continuous assessment so that they can have feedback and know where they are. And now we get to validated support strategies with the personal supports. Okay. Now there's lots of different ways people are supported. There's natural supports, there's circle of friends, there's paraprofessional supports. Now, you will likely have access to this in one of your placements, but just a thought, a very common concept is something called circle of friends. In the middle of this circle, what you see is family. These are the people closest to you, the people you love. Okay. Notice it has nothing to say about birthright and who gave, who picked you up from school, because we want to eliminate abuses, and we also want to make students responsible for choosing who those people are that they love. Number two, in that circle, it's people you really like, but you're not close enough to for circle number one. So for example, there's lots of people that I'm very, very friendly with. I enjoy spending time with them. But in general, I might not tell them my biggest problems. I might not trust them with to help me with my finances, right? Circle 3 is groups of people you like or do things with. Again, this can be a group that's a little bigger, like church groups, friendship groups, where once again, it's pretty social, you enjoy, but it's not a group you necessarily go to with problems. Circle 4, people paid to know you. So these are all of your teachers and your dentists and doctors and physical therapists and nurses. Now, one of the reasons Circle of Friends is so important is because many times we have to teach students where different people belong in that circle. We have to teach them to analyze where people should belong in that circle. For example, it might be common that a teacher is closer in the circle than all the way out on number 4. And it might be that a family member isn't even included in the circle because of something they've done to push them out. So I've used Circle of Friends many times with students to create instructional programmings that we'll talk about here in a couple of weeks, but to teach students appropriate behavior, appropriate terminology, and you'll know it when you see it, because these are the students who come up and tell you things that you're like, wow, you should talk to your mom and dad about that. Or they'll just talk to strangers in the lunchroom and tell them very, very personal things. So this is a really helpful idea. But again, if you take this larger concept, it's the idea that the strategies that are helpful for inclusion are all of these people coming together to help support individuals. And both you and I tap into these resources all the time. None of us just are low creatures that don't access supports from others. Now, some more ideas that you can get. Niche is a great resource. It is going to kick us over to the Parent Center Hub. Niche is out of order for the time being due to funding, but this site has hosted many of their resources. So there's lots of things in here. I like that a lot of this information's in Spanish, so you can share it with parents, but talks about placements, considering least restrictive environment, some starter sets of resources. So for those of us taking jobs in very seclusive programs, we can look at this and get more access to inclusion supports. And then finally, school discipline becomes a big issue. What happens when a student violates your code? And does that mean we absolutely have to move them? And then disciplinary regulations, which we do talk about in the intro class, but this is a good refresher as well. So moving back to our slide, just some closing thoughts. By the way, I love this picture, love this quote from Dr. King: an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And understanding disability history will put a lens on this, that the more we put people in secluded environments, the more we're asking for abuses and injuries and issues related to social justice. We've moved a long way away from that. One closing thought, and we're back to the author we started with, but we know that the world is an inclusive community. It's very important for children to have an opportunity to learn and grow within communities that represent the kind of world they'll live in when they finish high school. In closing, what I want to tell you is, at the end of the day, when school is over, we all go into an inclusive environment. Whether we're prepared for it or not is the question. With very sad exceptions of students going into care facilities and institutions, all students will eventually go into the full community. And the question is, are they going to be ready for it? If we've never worked with them in an inclusive setting during the school, and especially if we've only done it a little bit, they're not going to be ready for it. They're not going to have as much chance for success and happiness as if we start very early. So we're starting with this idea very early in the semester so that as we're talking about reading and math and all of these other wonderful academics, you realize that we're really trying to get you to think about doing this in inclusive classroom settings rather than pulling students out into specialized settings and working on things with a thought that it's better. Thinking back to your fact or fiction, how many of those were you surprised by? How many of those were you a little stunned that it's not better to pull kids? And so you should always leave it off with the question of, then why are we doing it? If it's not better, then why are we doing it? And what are the alternatives and how can we change that?